Welcome to a spiritual offering from Trinity Episcopal Church in Boonville, with the sermon of Mother Linda Logan for the 24th Sunday after Pentecost.
If the song's to be sung, we must sing it.
If the love's to be shared, we must bring it. For God is calling us now indeed to go where there is need.
If the word's to be heard, we must speak it.
If the peace is to come, we must seek it. For God is calling us now indeed to go where there is need. Someone's crying, Lord, kumbaya. Someone's dying, Lord, kumbaya. Someone's praying, Lord, kumbaya. Oh Lord, kumbaya.
Kumbaya, my Lord. Kumbaya, my Lord. Kumbaya, my Lord. Oh Lord,
Kumbaya.
songs to be sung, we must sing it. If the love's to be shared, we must bring it.
For God is calling us one by one until the work is done.
If the word's to be heard, we must speak it. If the peace is to come, we must seek it.
For God is calling us one by one until the work is done. For God is calling us everyone until the work is done. Oh Lord,
In the name of the one holy God, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer. Amen. This is quite a set of readings this morning. The first tells us that the Lord sold his people because they did evil in his sight. The second, although it says God has not destined us for wrath, tells us that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. And the gospel? You know that the talent of the story is a unit of money. But what it represents is what God invests in us. These readings are what are designated for this Sunday at the end of the church year, where the focus is about to switch to the coming of Christ. But they are also coming to us in the midst of a deeply troubled time in our land. What are we to make of them? The first reading from the book of Judges is one of numerous accounts within that book of the difficulties the people of Israel had in settling the land of Canaan. It is one of a cycle of readings in which the people do what is evil in the sight of the Lord, then get sold by the Lord into the hand of some king, then cry out to the Lord for help, and get saved by the intervention of the Lord through one of the judges or military leaders of Israel. This cycle repeats over and over as the people fall away from the covenant they have with God. And what we see in the repeating cycle is God's justice tempered time and again with God's mercy. But that expression, which we hear over and over, that the Lord sold his people because of their failure to live lives devoted to God, sits like a weight in our hearts as we read the stories. The second reading, which is from Paul's first letter to the church at Thessalonica, offers a description of the day of the Lord. This is an ancient concept. Writings in the Bible often distinguish between the present age, that is, the period of history reflected in the text, and the future coming age, or period of transformed life that God will bring at the end of history. These writings contain teachings about events expected to take place during the last days of the present age, or events anticipated at the beginning of or during the age to come. It was the threshold between the two ages that was sometimes referred to as the day of the Lord. On that day, in that period of time, it was believed that God would in some way deliver the people. Paul's letter, which was likely written in the year 50 or 51, is widely agreed to be the earliest of all New Testament writings. It reflects the life of a congregation that was devoted to its faith and that was deeply aware of its separation from the surrounding society. But it was also a community that was threatened by social pressures and at times persecution to turn back to the life from which its members had come. Paul wrote to encourage the church. He also wrote to respond to questions about last things that were troubling the church. Both Paul and the Thessalonians believed that Jesus was going to return any day. Some of the Thessalonians were perplexed by the deaths of believers and wondered whether those who had died would be excluded from the life of the resurrection. So Paul puts these fears to rest by telling them a story about the events of the end time, which makes it clear that all believers will be with the Lord forever, not just those who are still living when the Lord returns. Paul also stresses the fact that, although he and they believe that the end will come very soon, no one knows when that time will be. The day of the Lord, he says, will come like a thief in the night. But all who are children of the light, that is, people who belong to God, need not worry. They are just to live in faith, love, and hope. So this reading, though dealing with the end time, is not threatening. At least, not to persons who are at one with God. Now let's look at the gospel reading. It comes from a text which was written sometime between the last decade of the 1st century and the early 2nd century by an unknown Jewish Christian living either in western Syria or southern Galilee. This writer may have used as one of his sources a collection of Jesus' sayings that the Apostle Matthew is said to have drawn up. But whether or not that writer did, a title containing Matthew's name and signifying apostolic authority came to be applied to the whole gospel. So we, like everyone else, will follow convention and refer to the writer as Matthew. The parable that Matthew tells us Jesus told is difficult to understand if it's taken literally. For what could be so awful about someone burying the money someone has given them in order to protect it? But reading the story this way, we miss the point. The story is a parable, and the clue to understanding it is the worth of a talent. The Jesus Seminar renders the talents given to the respective slaves as 30,000, 12,000, and 6,000 silver coins, and points out that the last of these sums equals about 20 years' wages for the common laborer. The story is an allegory, that is, a story in which the meaning parallels and illustrates something deeper. And if you subtract the refrain, "Enter into the joy of your master," and the last verse about throwing the slave into the outer darkness, you have a story which the seminar thinks Jesus probably did tell. And it's a story about the abundance with which God has entrusted us. What the story is saying is that God has entrusted each of us with love and giftedness beyond measure. And that if we take this trust reverently, we will invest our love and giftedness in the world for the sake of God's kingdom. If we do, even more will be given to us to develop. And if we don't, we will lose what we were given to begin with. For abilities not used wither away. So this is a story about what we do with ourselves in this life. What we do in this present age, leading up to the age in which God will be all in all. So, what do we understand from the readings we have this morning? How are we to understand them in our context, our society, in which economic disparity and fear and hatred based on skin color still reign? What can we take from this morning's readings? From Judges, to not do what is evil in God's sight. From 1 Thessalonians, to live at one with God despite the pressures of society. And from Matthew, to invest in the world what God has invested in us. This is our commission, to not carry out evil, to not give in to pressures that divert us from the ways of God, but to live the covenant we have with God, to use our God-given giftedness for the sake of God's ways being realized in this world. You know, as I've been meditating on this, one line of a hymn has been trying to rise in my mind. But it was from the second verse. The first verse, and with it the title, finally rose up. It's God of grace and God of glory. The words of the Reverend Harry Emerson Fosdick, set to the most loved Welsh hymn tune, Cumranda. If I were in voice, I would sing the entire second verse, but I am not, so I will just recite the words. The hymn was written in an earlier time, during the Depression of the 1930s, and as a call to social justice then. But there is as much need today to take Fosdick's words to heart. Lo, the hosts of evil round us scorn thy Christ, assail his ways. From the fears that long have bound us, free our hearts to faith and praise. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the living of these days. For the living of these days.
Voice to speak his kindness, no eyes to see the pain,
no heartbeat of compassion, no empathy remains.
How will they hear the message that Jesus is alive? How can they know the truth unless it's through our lives? Christ has no hands except your own to reach the world and make him known. His love can change humanity by our touch alone. Christ has no hands except our own. No truth to scatter darkness, no candle in the night, no warm illumination, no justice, no right. When will we recognize, open our blinded eyes? We are the lighthouse to shine his light. Christ has no hands except our own to reach the world and make him known. His love can change humanity by our touch alone. Christ has no hands except our own, touching the desperate, feeling their pain, reaching the hopeless in Jesus' name, in Jesus' name. Christ has no hands except our own to reach the world and make him known. His love can change humanity by our touch alone. Christ has no hands except our own. No voice, no eyes, no hands except our own. We are the hands of Christ, the hands of Christ. This has been a spiritual offering from Trinity Episcopal Church in Boonville. We're glad you could join us and hope you can again next week.